The Cold War, cross-check, the story of the Stastny brothers. Directions, read the passage, and then answer the questions that follow. The Cold War was a geopolitical, relating to politics, especially international relations, ideological and economic struggle, primarily between the United States of America and the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. During this long period of heightened tension, the lives of millions of people around the globe were greatly affected. 3 hockey players from Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, were among those caught in the crossfire of the Cold War. To truly appreciate their story, you must first understand the unfolding events which led up to their daring escape. In 1917, the Russian Revolution brought the Communist Party into power and established the Soviet Union, which grew into an extremely powerful state. The Soviet Union would eventually encompass a total of 15 republics, including and dominated by Russia. Most of Eastern Europe fell under the Soviet control and was considered the Eastern Bloc. Western Bloc countries were independent democracies, in contrast to the strict control the Soviet Union had over its satellite states, countries that are formally independent but under heavy influence or control from another country. In 1961, the Soviet Union constructed the Berlin Wall in an attempt to prevent people in East Berlin from defecting or abandoning one's country or cause in favor of another. In addition, borders throughout the Eastern Bloc became heavily guarded. Europe had become divided physically, ideologically, and symbolically by what Winston Churchill called an Iron Curtain. After the Russian Revolution, the Soviet government created the Czech, whose primary purpose was to work largely in secret against the political opponents of the government. To achieve that goal, the secret police would enforce the policies of the government through surveillance, intimidation, and even physical violence. The scope of the secret police would grow and expand until it became the most powerful and feared institution for individuals living behind the Iron Curtain. Citizens in Eastern Bloc countries would constantly feel as though they were being watched. Children were even encouraged to report on their own families. Informants were everywhere, and it was difficult to know whom you could trust. In 1948, the Soviet Union took control of Czechoslovakia and sealed its borders. In Czechoslovakia, orders would now be taken from Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. Czechoslovakian citizens were losing the freedom to make their own choices. For example, it was mandatory that people show loyalty to the communist government by displaying red flags on state holidays. In addition, the communist government took control of the schools. Citizens needed to participate in the Spartakiad, promoting individual subordination, which encourages putting the interest of the state ahead of your own. Western books, music, art, radio, and clothing were strictly prohibited. In January 1968, a reformist, or a person who advocates bringing about change with good intentions, Alexander Dubček, was elected first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. He wanted to grant additional rights to the citizens of the country by opening up the government's strict hold over the economy as well as broaden its democracy. This season of progressive change in Czechoslovakian capital was called the Prague Spring. Dubček sought to get rid of strict censorship that has been imposed on his country's citizens by easing heavy restrictions on media, speech, and travel. He also tried to expand the rights of workers and rehabilitate those who were unjustly persecuted in the past. The Prague Spring filled many citizens with long-awaited hope, but also greatly angered the old guard and the Soviet leaders. On August 21st, troops from the Warsaw Pact, which was a 1955 military alliance between the Soviet Union and several Eastern European countries, invaded Czechoslovakia in a brutal show of force. Czechoslovakian citizens tried their best to interfere with the invasion and distract the soldiers, even forming human blockades. Ultimately, the Soviet-led invasion would not be denied. Alexander Dubček, along with the members of the Czech government, were sent to Moscow for what was called re-education. After the successful invasion of Czechoslovakia, new leaders reversed nearly all of the reforms that Dubček had implemented. In the following year, Czechoslovakia would go on to beat the Soviet Union in the 1969 World Ice Hockey Championship. Years later, Alexander Dubček would recall, "The whole country watched. It was much more than ice hockey, of course. It was a replay of a lost war." The seeds of the Prague Spring had been planted, however, and it inspired important work and efforts from the variety of individuals and groups, which would eventually lead to a Garden of Freedom. Athletes from the Eastern Bloc were forced to abide by a very strict set of rules. There were rigid laws set up to prevent them from leaving their home countries to play for teams in the West. Those who tried to escape and got caught would face severe punishments. They could be thrown in prison and have their families subjected to further retaliation from the government. Attempting to leave meant putting your life and the lives of those you loved at risk. Some of the greatest athletes in the world lived under this dark cloud until the Cold War finally ended. Marian, Peter, and Anton Stastny grew up playing Bratislava. Their great love of the sport seemed to be matched by their talent. The brothers even found a way to play positions next to each other on the ice. Peter at center, Anton on the left wing, and Marian on the right wing, so that the three were able to form one of the most impressive lines anywhere in the hockey world. Marian, who's the oldest, was the first to enter Czechoslovakia's professional league called HC Slovan Bratislava in 1970, followed by Peter and then Anton. By the time of the 1979 World Championships, the Stastny brothers were turning heads, and their incredible skill was no secret to scouts in North America. In Bratislava, the Stastny brothers were constantly made aware of what life was like under communist rule. Speaking out against this oppression was greatly discouraged by their government. Peter, in particular, was known to complain about things he felt were unfair, especially when it concerned the management of his hockey team. He also appreciated and longed for the freedom of the West. As special a player as he was, Peter knew that if he didn't obey the wishes of the communist government, they would do whatever was necessary to get him in line, including banning him from playing hockey. Peter Stastny would later explain, "I knew I had no future there. After hockey, there would be nothing for me. Either I adapt to them, which I considered impossible, or I would end up as a laborer. When somebody was threatening my hockey career, it was worse than threatening my life. They made the decision easy for me, and I'm eternally grateful." Anton agreed to join Peter in a bold attempt to escape. The brothers believed their best chance was during the World Championship tournament in Austria. Unfortunately, Marian would not be able to join his younger brothers in their planned defection. The Czechoslovakian government rarely allowed children of star athletes to travel with their parents to dissuade a potential escape. If Marian had attempted to bring his wife and 3 children to the tournament, he would have likely alerted the secret police to the plan. Anton had already been drafted by the Quebec Nordics in 1979. It was a risky pick by the Nordics since players of the Eastern Bloc were not permitted to leave to play in the NHL. On the other hand, the Quebec Nordics had an even larger plan in mind at the time. Their ultimate goal was to eventually acquire all 3 brothers, uniting the famed Stastny line in the NHL. Marcel Abat was the team's president, and Gilles Leger was the director of player development. Both would play an integral role in getting the Stastny brothers safely to Canada. Soon after arriving in Austria, Peter made a call to Leger, letting him know that they were ready to attempt the escape. Peter Stastny would say, "The decision was by far the toughest decision I ever made, or had to make, and it was the best decision in my life too. There were so many ways it could have gone wrong." Abbott and Leger flew to Austria as quick as a flash. The plan of escape would take place after the game of the tournament. Peter walked out of his hotel to find a getaway car waiting for him. His wife, Dorina, was inside, and there was no sign of Anton. Peter worried that the plan may have been uncovered, in which case Anton could have been apprehended already. Once again, Peter had to make the difficult decision of leaving without one of his brothers. Luckily, there had simply been some confusion in the planning, and Anton and Peter found each other soon after. The escapees then drove through the night to make it to Vienna, Austria's capital. At that point, officials from the Canadian embassy rushed the group through the city in a daring attempt to avoid getting caught by the police. Fortunately, they arrived safely at the airport and were able to board a plane headed for Canada. 2 of the 3 Stastny brothers had just left the clutches of communism behind them. As soon as Peter and Anton joined the Quebec Nordics, the team and the city responded. In his first season, Peter broke the rookie scoring record en route to winning the Calder Trophy as the league's best rookie. Even though the 2 didn't speak any French, they quickly became fan favorites in Quebec City. The Stastny brothers would go on to help spark a run of 7 straight playoff appearances. Sadly, for the brother who remained behind in the Iron Curtain, life would not be so sweet. The government punished Marian because of the defection of his brothers. He was no longer allowed to play the sport that he loved. He was even banned from being involved in hockey in any way. Their father was demoted at work, and their parents were denied an apartment they had been waiting on for years. The government offered Marian the chance to play hockey again as long as he was willing to speak out publicly against his brothers. After he refused, his chances of ever playing hockey in Czechoslovakia were gone. He explained, "I simply said to myself, there's no other way than to escape the country and save my family and save a few of the years of my hockey career." The Quebec Nordics always had the vision of reuniting the three Stastny brothers together in Canada. They knew the Czechoslovakian government would make things very difficult on Marian after his brothers defected, so the organization provided Marian and his family with money so they could survive. The true goal, of course, was to get Marian and his family out, and the plan started to take root over the course of the next several months in 1980. The family took short trips out of the country under the guise of an outward appearance concealing the true nature of remodeling their home. These trips all followed the extremely strict guidelines for traveling outside the country set forth by the Czechoslovakian government. On one final trip, however, instead of returning home, the family kept going and never looked back. They made it all the way to Vienna, Austria, where Marian contacted the Nordics. Once again, Abbott and Leger immediately put their plan into action, making the necessary arrangement to bring Marian and his family to Canada. Finally, they were all free, and the complete Stastny brothers line would be reformed in Quebec for the 1981-1982 season. Impressively, but perhaps not surprisingly, the first season all three Stastny brothers played together in the NHL, the Quebec Nordics made it all the way to the conference finals. In 1988, despite what must have seemed like an impossible dream as a child, Peter Stastny was elected to the Hockey Hall of Fame. A man named Václav Havel would help ignite a spark that would eventually become the Velvet Revolution, a nonviolent transition from the Soviet-supported communist government in Czechoslovakia in 1989. Born in Prague, Havel was a dissident, or a person who opposes official policy, especially that of an authoritarian state, playwright who spoke out against the injustices he saw firsthand behind the Iron Curtain. Although his protests and defiance against the powerful authority resulted in years of jail, his eloquence made him a hero to the Czech people as well as an inspiration to many others throughout Eastern Europe. In 1989, after the Berlin Wall fell, he became the president of his beloved Czechoslovakia. His election symbolized a new day for Czech unity and freedom. Once the Berlin Wall fell, like a system of dominoes, one country after the other in the Eastern Bloc gained its freedom, until the Soviet Union finally broke up in 1991. The Cold War was over. In 1993, Czechoslovakia split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. If you watch the NHL today, you'll see a wide array of players from former Eastern Bloc countries. Not so long ago, however, when the Iron Curtain seemed impenetrable, it was the Stastny brothers who helped pave the way. Number 1, read the following from paragraph 4. Czechoslovakian citizens were losing the freedom to make their own choices. For example, it was mandatory that people show loyalty to communist government by displaying red flags on state holiday. Mandatory means optional, suggested, left up to individuals, required by law or rules. Read the following sentence from paragraph 5. The Prague Spring filled many citizens with long-awaited hope, but also greatly angered the old guard and the Soviet leaders. What literary tools used by the author? Personification, alliteration, foreshadowing events to come, or the use of humor to entertain the audience. Number 3, read the following sentence from paragraph 11. The Czechoslovakian government rarely allowed children of star athletes to travel with their parents to dissuade a potential escape. Dissuade means encourage, allow, assist, or discourage. Read the following sentence from paragraph 12. Abbott and Leger flew to Austria as quick as a flash. What literary tool is used by the author? A simile, a definition, alliteration, none of the above. Number 5, which statement best describes the main idea of the passage? If you watch NHL today, you'll see a wide array of players from the former East Bloc countries. Alexander Dubček and Václav Havel were important leaders in the history of Czechoslovakia. Despite the challenges and risks involved, the Stastny brothers attempted to escape from Czechoslovakia to start a new life in Canada. Or the Berlin Wall was an important physical and symbolic structure during the Cold War. The last sentence of the passage states, not so long ago, however, when the Iron Curtain seemed impenetrable, it was the Stastny brothers who helped pave the way. The word impenetrable means easy to flow through, impossible to pass through, clear, or passable. And number 7, in your opinion, was the daring escape by the Stastny brothers worth the risk? And then it says usually at least 2 examples to support your answer.